And welcome to all of you. My name is John Efron. I teach Jewish history in the history department, but I still don't know when the Bible was written, so I look forward to learning about that. This is part of a series of lectures that we have, so I just want to bring your attention to a lecture that we have next week at this time by Steve Weitzman, who started life as a Bible scholar and has roamed far and wide from that, but he's just come out with a new book on the origin of the Jews, and his talk next week is entitled "How Does the Story of the Jews Begin? Recent Debates on Origins and Ancestry." So Ron is dealing with the text, and Steve will be talking about the people of the text, or who wrote the text. So that's next week, 5:15, same time, at the Magnus. Ron, for those who don't know, has been here for some time, in 1999, and is a scholar of the Hebrew Bible, a preeminent scholar of the Hebrew Bible. And he studies the Bible, looks at the Bible through a number of different prisms, through the history of religions as one approach that he takes, and textual criticism, linguistics and philology, comparative mythology, literature, and through the prism of cultural memory. He is also the editor, and there's a very long list of publications, but he's the editor-in-chief of the Hebrew Bible, a critical edition, which he assures me is better than the original. A new critical edition of the Hebrew text itself. The first volume on Proverbs came out in 2015. Remembering Abraham, Culture, History and Memory of the Hebrew Bible, reading Genesis, 10 Methods, the Book of Genesis, a biography. And most recently is this book that he has co-authored with Jan Houston called How Old is the Hebrew Bible? A Linguistic, Textual and Historical Study. Ron is not just a dear friend and dear colleague, but a co-teacher of mine, even though we're thousands of years apart in the histories that we study and the work that we do. We managed to cobble together a course called Ancient Israel in the Modern Western Imagination. I do the modern period, Ron does the ancient period. And it's been one of the highlights of my time here at Berkeley, which is now coming on to 17 years. It's a pleasure to teach with him and a pleasure to be friends with him and to learn from him as well, as you are all going to do right now. So please welcome Ron Hendel.
Thank you. Thanks, John. It's a delight to... Is it a delight? It's a harrowing trial to be here before you today, because I have the challenge of describing this book that I wrote with a friend of mine at Oxford, which is a very specialist book. Okay? So these three people in my graduate seminar, they can sort of understand what I'm trying to do. The rest of you won't have a clue. So my task today is to talk you through what I'm trying to do and give you some examples, give you a taste of things, and do it so that you're not all comatose or catatonic by the end.
Isn't the answer a number?
Oh. Yeah, good. So let me give you a short answer. How old is the Bible? And I'm specifically talking about how old is the Hebrew Bible.
Right.
The answer is pretty old. Any questions? Thank you. I told you I could do it in less than... yeah, it's pretty old. So now, this is one of the things that scholars do. Okay? We get involved in these long discussions, these long arguments. This particular argument has been going on for... since about 1600. And we're not quite finished with this argument yet, but you could actually argue it started earlier. Abraham ibn Ezra, who was one of the great medieval Jewish commentators, noticed that there are parts of the Pentateuch that Moses couldn't have written. For example, his burial. I mean, he could have written it. And there's one wonderful little story in the Talmud where one rabbi argues, well, no, Moses wrote it, but a tear came down his eyes as he wrote it. Isn't that sweet? Because he's writing about his own funeral and stuff. But Ibn Ezra noticed that, you know, there's things even in the burial of Moses. It says no one knows where that was. So, you know, it's as if it has been forgotten. And then it says there hasn't been since that day, there hasn't been another man like Moses with whom God spoke face to face. Now, Ibn Ezra was a very smart reader of texts, and he realized, you know, if it says ever since then, there hasn't been someone like Moses, this was written a good time after Moses. But Ibn Ezra said very wisely, this is a secret of the text. He didn't go into these details. He just says, he called the end of Deuteronomy 34, which has 12 verses, he called that the secret of the 12. Okay? And he said, let he who understands keep silent. So he liked to give hints for the wise about these things that he was perceiving in the text. But he was himself wise enough not to say it out loud. So let those who understand keep silent. Now the problem with modern scholars is that we can't keep silent. Okay? And it was actually Baruch Spinoza, my favorite Jewish heretic, who said it out loud in very strong terms for the first time. And he said, Ibn Ezra pointed out this, and what he meant was X, Y, and Z. So there's all these places, all these clues that the Pentateuch, or at least large chunks of it, must have been written a long time after the time of Moses. And Spinoza concluded it is as clear as the light of day that Moses did not write the Pentateuch. And he had other reasons too. So that's a big difference, saying keep quiet versus it's clear as the light of day. Okay? So, but this kind of course, this is why he was expelled from the Jewish community and declared a heretic and so forth. It was actually before he wrote that, but he might have been saying things like that earlier. So this is what biblical scholars have been doing since, 1670 or so, when Spinoza first published this. Trying to figure out how old is the Hebrew Bible, who wrote it, trying to set its, and again, this is part of the program that Spinoza laid out. What is the history of the book? The history of the composition of the book, how it was passed down over time, how different people put together the different books or even the different parts of books, how the vicissitudes that the text experienced through time, how different people have understood it, and so forth. And the goal is for all this historicizing, is to understand the text on its own terms to the most granular degree that we can. So it's all got a hermeneutical thrust that we want to read the text and understand it. So in a sense, this is a set of preliminary questions. But, it still takes 400 years to work through the preliminary questions. Let me show you a picture here. How old is the Bible? This is a really lousy picture of one of the oldest scrolls that we have of the Bible. This is from the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is the 1Q Isaiah, which means it's from Cave 1 of Qumran, which is these caves by the Dead Sea. And this is a scroll of Isaiah, and it's the first scroll of Isaiah that was found. This is called the Great Isaiah Scroll. You can't really tell here. Oh, that's better. Yeah, you can see it's really great. It's about half of the book. And this was one of the very first scrolls found from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's actually so readable that when it was first found, the Bedouin took it to an antiquities dealer in Bethlehem, who was also a shoemaker. He was an antiquities dealer on the side until he got the Dead Sea Scrolls. Then I think he stopped making shoes. But this cobbler took it to various scholars, and it's so readable, they said, oh, this must have been from like a 19th century synagogue. because it's in really, really good shape. But in fact, this is from about 150 BC or BCE, and it just happened to be beautifully preserved in these caves at Qumran. So these are the oldest actual texts that we have of the Hebrew Bible. Okay, stuff from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And they range from, the oldest of these is from maybe 250 BCE or so. And so those are the oldest actual texts of the Hebrew Bible that we have. So you can say that it's not more recent than, let's say, 250 BC, because we have actual copies that are that old. If the books went through a complicated process of composition and compilation and so forth, then you have to push it back at least a little bit farther. In the last 50 years or so, some scholars have argued that you really don't have to push them more than, say, 50 or 100 years before the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so there's a lot of scholars, now let me just tell you, let me just say in passing, they're wrong. Okay? But there's a lot of scholars who argue that most of the Hebrew Bible, or all of the Hebrew Bible, was written relatively late in what we would call the Hellenistic period, or in the Persian period. This is after the Babylonian exile, after the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple and the monarchy and stuff like that. Before that, the idea was most of the Hebrew Bible, the parts of it are pre-exilic, before the exile, during the time of the Israelite kings, and then some of the late books are post-exilic, written in the...
When you say written, do you mean compiled, or do you mean somebody sent?
Good question, good question. The process of writing and compiling. But really we're talking about writing, because it's hard to tell when you can compile really old texts. The picture that we have, at least for the Pentateuch, for the Torah, the picture that we have in the Bible is that Ezra brings it back from Babylonian exile and brings this Torah of Moses to Jerusalem and reads it all day long. And it's a really sweet scene because all the old people cry because they remember the glory of the pre-exilic period, and he just reads it all day long. So this is the picture that we have in the Bible of the kind of publication of the Torah, that is to say, making it public. So at least the biblical idea is that by, the 5th century or so, at least the Torah was finished. But yes.
Of Ezra's generation were like more than 100 years after the destruction of the temple.
Yeah. So the idea.
How would they get nostalgic over something that they never saw?
Gee, that's a really good question.
Ezra's,
It said all the people cried, but you're right. That's like 450. There wouldn't have been anyone there from before 586. Yeah. Well, you'd cry anyway. It's evoking the past grandeur of the people, and now the people is in ruins, and it's poor, and Jerusalem is a destruction. Yeah, so it was that they remembered, but not personally, the grandeur of the people. Yeah, that's a good point. Although Methuselah lived 969 years, so, give or take. But even if, so the idea here, and I'm not saying this is how it happened, but this is the biblical picture, that Ezra came from Babylonian exile. There was a big Jewish community in Babylon, as there was for many thousands of years. They were the people that later wrote the Babylonian Talmud. That people there would have done the compiling. They would have had documents that were brought to the exile from Jerusalem, and that people there would have done the compiling, and then Ezra brought it back in this put together form. So the question is, how old are these texts, even if they don't become public until this period of this is the Persian period already for Ezra, but how old is the stuff that's in those books? Okay, and as I've said, there's a lot of scholars who in recent generations have argued that all of it was from roughly the time of Ezra, that it was mostly written at the time when it was first published.
Sorry, when you say all of it, are you talking about the Tanakh, or are you talking about just the...
Yeah, I'm being fuzzy here, I think on
Because
purpose.
there's a lot of very ancient information that would be hard to dredge up 500 years later, who is the king?
Okay, this is a good counter-argument against
But
most
it
of
could
the
have been
people
there
in my
when it was
field.
assembled.
Yeah. So we're talking primarily about the Pentateuch, the Torah, and the former prophets. Okay, so Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And a bunch of the prophetic books. So if everything is from the time of Ezra, more or less, or from the Persian period and then later the Hellenistic period, then the stuff that looks and sounds old, in fact, isn't. The stuff that looks and sounds pre-exilic, stories about Solomon and David and, Neo-Assyrian Empire and stuff, would have been later imaginings by this later
They
period.
got some things right, so there must have been some older information.
Yeah. So, but in a sense, you're replicating the discussion within the field over the last 40 years. Okay. And let me just say again, the people who argue that it's all late are wrong. So these points that you're making, that biblical scholars have made, how would they know that Shishak went to war against Jerusalem in the 10th century? How would they know that in the 5th century? And that's a good question. And in fact, that's an argument that they wouldn't have known things like that. But most of my colleagues in Europe dated most of the Bible into the exilic and post-exilic periods. A bunch of them in America, a bunch of them in England. So I would say it's at least half and half, that half of the field has bought this story that it's all late. Now, this is why my friend and I wrote this book, to refute that, which is another fun thing that scholars get to do. We love to argue. So here's the oldest texts. Now, how do you really date this stuff then? How do you tell what's old and what's not? And there's all sorts of things that you can say. I mean, it's something like, how would you know about some Egyptian pharaoh invading the place? Well, you could argue that there were stelae or archives that you could consult. I mean, most of our knowledge of ancient Egyptian history actually comes from a Hellenistic era history of Egypt written by a Egyptian priest who writes in Greek. So there was ancient history that was known in the Hellenistic period. So how do we really adjudicate these sorts of issues? So one of the things, and I think really the only solid way to do it, is to understand the history of the language, to understand the history of biblical Hebrew. So this means you're doing linguistics, historical linguistics. And what the general picture that people have developed, at least in rough form, is that there are 4 different phases of ancient biblical Hebrew. The oldest part, and again, these are very controversial issues in my field. I'm just telling you the correct version. Okay? But a lot of people would say, no, this is all baloney. But again, they would be wrong. Okay, so there's old poems that have what many of us would argue is a phase of the language that we call archaic biblical Hebrew. This is the oldest phase of the Hebrew language, that's the oldest preserved phase of the Hebrew language. This is in poems like the Song of the Sea in Exodus 15, where Moses and the Israelites are praising God for destroying the Egyptians and leading people through the Red Sea. The Song of Deborah in Judges 5, which is another kind of war hymn about a war against the Canaanites. The blessings of Jacob at the end of Genesis, where Jacob is blessing and describing all of the different tribes of Israel who are his children or descendants of his children. And the blessings of Moses at the end of Deuteronomy, where Moses is doing something very similar. He's giving blessings and occasionally curses on the different tribes of Israel. So this is arguably the oldest phase. And this here is a picture of the last part of the Song of the Sea, one of these old poems, from the oldest complete copy of the Hebrew Bible that we have, which is called the St. Petersburg Codex or the Leningrad Codex, I like to refer to it as St. Petersburg because the place isn't Leningrad anymore. And I don't think Lenin was that admirable of a guy. But even the scribes who are transmitting these, they sensed that this was poetry, and so they put it in an interesting poetic form, which then goes into the prose that follows the poem. So this is just an example from our oldest complete biblical text. This dates to about 1000 CE. And there's all sorts of beautiful little commentary, philological notes and kind of concordance things up here, and then they make them into funny little shapes, which is very cute. This is what medieval scribes did to amuse themselves. Okay. Most of the prose that we have in the Pentateuch and the former prophets is written in a register and dialect of Hebrew that we call classical biblical Hebrew. Okay? Going to the fourth one, late biblical Hebrew, is a more developed kind of Hebrew that we have in books that are clearly later books, like the book of Esther, the book of Chronicles, that mention things during the Persian period. Okay? So when there's references to Persian things, the style of the language that correlates with that is late biblical Hebrew. And then recently people have argued that some books have a kind of interesting mix between classical and late, and so have come up with the label transitional biblical Hebrew. These are books like Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Lamentations that come on either side, either side of the Babylonian exile. So basically what we do in this book is try to collect all of the relevant evidence and to advance our understanding of the details of archaic biblical Hebrew, classical Hebrew, transitional Hebrew, and late Hebrew, extending it beyond, and a lot of this is my colleague at Oxford, who has really extended our understanding of these phases beyond merely words and lexicon into grammar. Okay? And so this is really important, I think, because to some degree, and people argue that, well, why couldn't in the Persian period, even if people are writing late biblical Hebrew, why couldn't they write classical biblical Hebrew too? In which case it all could have been written around the time of Ezra. Part of our argument is, if it's just a matter of words, individual nouns, you pretty much could do that. I mean, I could say thee and thou, right? And I could sort of fake Shakespearean English by throwing in a bunch of these and thous and, a fardel and, a few words that you know from Shakespeare. How goest thou this lofty day, gentle person? Wherefore art thou going, crossing the street to get to Starbucks? Oh, wherefore? So you tricked me. Okay, so now here's some of the thing. You have to really know the meaning of these words to get them right. Wherefore means why. Okay, who knew? But you can do it to some degree with vocabulary. It's much, much harder to do it with syntax. Because syntax and grammar, what kind of sequences of clauses and things like that, this is a much more kind of unconscious aspect of linguistic competence. Okay? And I just wouldn't have a clue about how to reproduce Shakespearean syntax. It's just not something that's really consciously available in your mind, unless you're a linguist. So part of our argument is that the differences between these different phases are not just, thou versus you, nouns that replace each other. There's also very subtle but systematic syntactic, grammatical patterns that change from one to the other. And these things you can't really fake. You can't really imitate correctly. I mean, in theory one could, but ordinary people can't. Okay, and even extraordinary people, I think, wouldn't be able to. So our argument is that this four-part division of the phases of Hebrew really is a chronological sequence. So that, for example, if most of the book of Samuel is written in classical biblical Hebrew, this is an earlier phase than the corresponding parts of the book of Chronicles, which is written in late biblical Hebrew, which is what people sort of thought all the time, but this is what people have argued isn't the case, but now we're saying, yeah, it really is the case. What else did I want to say? So these are not different styles that are contemporary, that are contemporaneous literary styles. These are really sequential linguistic periods. Oh yeah, the other thing I want to say is, how do you understand the sequence? Which one or how can you know? Let me say this again. Even if you can determine that these are relatively sequential, how can you put absolute dates to things? That's a big question. The answer is the only way you can do that is to have linguistic things that are datable. And we do have those to a certain degree in the inscriptions that we have in ancient Hebrew. Okay? We have pre-exilic inscriptions, and they are written in classical biblical Hebrew. And again, not just the words, but as we demonstrate, the syntax. Okay? So this gives us an empirical peg to say that classical biblical Hebrew was the type of Hebrew that was used in the pre-monarchic period, from, let's say 900 to 600 BC. Now this is nice. So this is where our inscriptions come from. This means that we can date these books like Samuel and most of the Pentateuch and most of Kings and so forth to the period of classical biblical Hebrew, to the 9th to the 6th century BC. So this gives us a leg up on previous discussions that were more impressionistic or that used arguments of lexicon, which isn't as strong as syntax, and it absolutely destroys the people who say that this stuff was written in the Persian period. Now they don't know it yet, but it destroys them. Okay, let me give you an example. And first I want to give you an example of lexicon, because it's the most straightforward. This example is the word for letter, like when you write a letter and send it to somebody. It used to be, now I know I'm looking around, you can understand this. It used to be people sent physical letters on paper to each other. Do you know that? My children don't know that. They say, what's that, paper? This is some archaic Iron Age contrivance. But in the Iron Age, they did send letters, and it would be on papyrus, usually, and sometimes it would be on a potsherd. And this is an example of a papyrus one, a papyrus letter. This was found a few years ago. This is from the 7th century BC, so in the pre-exilic period. And it's in very nice handwriting. My students over here can't quite see it, but it says here, on the bottom line it says Jerusalem, and there's not a yud between the lamed and the mem. So this is really pre-exilic spelling of Jerusalem. Yerushalayim is how they would have said it. The ayim comes later. Okay, so this is a letter. The word for letter in classical Hebrew is simply sefer, which in modern Hebrew also means book, and in classical Hebrew it also means book or book scroll. But sefer also means letter. So if you send a letter to somebody, you're sending something like this. And this word sefer is used here in Samuel, in Kings, interestingly in Esther, which is a later book, Persian period book. But it's also used in Hebrew inscriptions of the pre-exilic period in letters like this. So it's saying, this is a letter that I'm sending to you to requisition some wine or something. And so they use the word sefer for letter. Now, at a certain point, another word comes to be used for letter that more or less replaces it or supplements it or kind of edges into that same semantic area, and the word is igeret. And this is the word you find in Nehemiah 7 times, in Chronicles 6 times, and also in Esther So interestingly, Esther uses both. Esther uses the older word sefer and also uses the newer word igeret. Now, igeret is actually, and this is good because I have a couple of the Assyriologists here, this comes from an old Babylonian word. What is it, igirtu? Igirtu? Okay, so this comes from a Babylonian word that is taken up into Aramaic, okay? And from Aramaic, it comes into Hebrew. Oh, I did that. Yep, that's good, thanks. Now this is interesting. First of all, one of the interesting things is that in the post-exilic period, in the Second Temple period, Hebrew became more or less a religious language, and the vernacular speech eventually became Aramaic. So the speech that people would do on a daily basis would be Aramaic. Aramaic replaced Hebrew as the vernacular. And so it is precisely because people are speaking Aramaic that these words from Aramaic, this was originally from Akkadian, but it was taken from Akkadian into Aramaic, and from Aramaic it comes into Hebrew. So that Aramaic provides the vehicle for these foreign words to come in and essentially replace in late biblical Hebrew these classical Hebrew words. But they don't replace them altogether in every case, because Esther uses both. Esther uses the old word and the new word. Okay, so this is a very simple example, and we can tell that igeret is later because it's brought in through Aramaic at a time when there are bilingual Aramaic Hebrew speakers, which is what people were in the Second Temple period, in the Persian period particularly. Okay, so this is a simple example where you can see that the words that are used, provide a kind of thumbprint for what phase of the language that is. If you only find sefer, like in Samuel and Kings, that's going to be indicative that this is classical biblical Hebrew. If you only have igeret, like Nehemiah and Chronicles, which we know from their content were written during the Persian period, then that's a marker for that. But then something like Esther can use both, but the fact that they're using igeret at all shows that this is a late biblical Hebrew book. So these are the kind of clues that we use. Now, in our book, the more interesting set of clues, or the more kind of empirical or deeper rooted clues, are things that are a little more subtle than just words replacing each other. And this is one that I promised to my students from last time. Not only are there syntactic differences, but those are too hard to explain to you. This is a difference where a classical word was either forgotten or reinterpreted in the late period. Okay, and so this also shows us a kind of timeline where new meanings are attached to old words. So the word yom means day in Hebrew. Okay, very common word because there's days every day of the week, right? The am ending for yomam is an adverbial ending, and it ends up meaning daily or by day. So you do something daily, okay? So the pillar of cloud will follow them by day and by night. The pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire will follow the Israelites in the wilderness by day and by night. So it uses the word yomam. It says yomam v'layla, daily and at night. And this is the classical meaning with the word having this adverbial sense. So it's used in Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, used in all these books. Now, in late biblical Hebrew, this word becomes reinterpreted, and from being an adverb, it becomes a noun that's reinterpreted as meaning daytime. So instead of an adverb, it's a noun. And so now it can have things like the definite article in front of it. Ha-yomam, the daytime. You can't really say the daily, well, unless it's the name of a newspaper. Okay, but daily is an adverb. But the yomam shows that it's being treated as a noun. And the noun now means daytime. And it's used that way a couple of times in Jeremiah. It's used in Ezekiel. It's used in Nehemiah. And interestingly, it's also used in Qumran Hebrew, which is the Hebrew of those Dead Sea Scrolls that I showed you before. I showed you a biblical scroll from the Dead Sea Scrolls. We also have a lot of scrolls that show documents written by that Dead Sea Scroll community. And a lot of those are in Hebrew, and they show us a particular dialect of late biblical Hebrew that we call Qumran Hebrew, because Qumran's the place. So we can see that this word means yomam, this word means daytime, in these texts that are either transitional or late, and also really late. Arguably, this reinterpretation of yomam is because they sort of forgot what the am ending meant. So it's a grammatical particle that makes a word adverbial, but they forgot it. It just kind of died. Okay? So they didn't know what it meant, and so they kind of reinterpreted, and they used an Aramaic form, which is yamam, to assimilate to this Hebrew word yomam. You see what I mean? So they're speaking Aramaic, and so they assimilate it to a similar looking and similar sounding Aramaic word that does mean daytime. So this also shows us the process by which Hebrew changed, and it interestingly shows us that in late biblical Hebrew, they had forgotten aspects of the classical grammar of classical biblical Hebrew. And so they generate new meanings and assimilate things to Aramaic words or to Aramaic syntax and so forth.
What is the question mark next to Nehemiah and the reference to the second edition of Jeremiah?
Oh, good. When I saw that this was in Jeremiah, yeah, this is another very interesting thing. And this is something we also talk about in the book. With some of the books of the Bible, we can tell from their textual history, from versions of those books that are in the Dead Sea Scrolls, sometimes versions that are preserved in the Old Greek translation, which is called the Septuagint. We can tell that some of these books circulated in antiquity in different editions. Okay, so for example, the book of Jeremiah was such a big hit that the publisher said, okay, we're going to come out with an expanded second edition. This is what publishers do. And so this is what happened. The book of Jeremiah circulated in a shorter form and in a longer form. And it's pretty clear that the longer form is the later expanded edition of Jeremiah.
So how come there are less occurrence of the word in the second edition than in the first?
Well, there's two occurrences in Jeremiah. I wanted both of them to be in the later expanded edition, because that would be good for me, because the second edition is later.
Right.
And interestingly, the second edition of Jeremiah does have a number of fingerprints that show that it's written in a later phase than the first edition of Jeremiah. In this case, however, I didn't get my wish, because there's one daytime meaning in the old edition and one daytime meaning in the second edition. But Jeremiah and Ezekiel are both transitional biblical Hebrew, so it doesn't upset me too much.
And what's by day in Hebrew?
Yomam.
No, that's daytime.
It's both. In classical, Yomam,
Oh, it's the same
Yomam
word.
V'layla is when the pillar of
The
cloud,
meaning.
it's the meaning, it's the same
Okay.
word, it's the same
Okay.
grapheme, but it's interpreted differently.
Okay.
So the classical meaning is by day, and then it later becomes reinterpreted into a noun meaning daytime. Good. Now, let me just tell you, I'm trying to pick easy examples, but you see how hard that is to do. So I'm not giving you any more complicated syntactic ones, but this is a nice one.
What was the question mark?
Okay, with the question mark with Nehemiah, there's one, this meaning here in Nehemiah says ha-yomam. And so that's clearly meaning it as a noun, the daytime. There's two other uses in Nehemiah, and it's hard for me to tell whether it's meaning daytime as a noun or by day as an adverb. So it's possible that these two meanings of Nehemiah were also reinterpreted like this one was, in which case they would belong in this column. And I think they use Yomam V'layla, which becomes a fixed phrase. And so Nehemiah could have been reading that daytime and night instead of by day and night. So it's hard to tell when it's a formulaic sense how Nehemiah is understanding it. Okay, good.
Ron,
Yes.
it's kind of nice because the example in Nehemiah 9, it adds a "b," which like
Oh, perfect.
adverbializes the noun.
So what does it say?
It says "b yomam."
Yeah. So that's by, yeah,
So it's-
Daytime, which
so
would
it's-
means
by daytime.
But it's making a,
Ah.
which means what
By
it recognizes
day.
as a noun form. into an
Is that b'yomam v'layla?
adverb. "B yomam," no.
Oh, just b'yomam. Okay, so if he's taking it as a noun, he's kind of
Adverbial.
adverbializing it, which is really nice. Because then you see these wheels within wheels of reinterpreting it, but then he has to make sense of it in its original context.
Put that in the next edition.
Yeah. We didn't even use this example in our book.
Oh no.
No, but my co-author uses it in another one of his articles. But I think it's a really nice example because it's kind of explanatory. And this is actually a picture of daytime. This is the symbol of Shamash, who's the god of the sun, in Akkadian, in Babylonian religion. See, you guys get some stuff here. That's Shamash's symbol. You know that. Okay. So this just gives you some insight into what kind of criteria, what kind of evidence. So we're not making it up, but it is, does require careful linguistic elucidation of, what the word is being used for and how it's understood and how it's reinterpreted and how Aramaic comes into it. So the more you get into these examples, the more you get this whole panorama of the development of the language and how it fits into the development of the history and the culture. Now, let me give you a couple of other examples of other sorts of things. I mentioned the old poetry. So here's my favorite example from the old poetry. And there's lots of them, but this is nice. In the Song of Deborah, at the end, one of the wise women who are in the court of the Canaanite queen, who's the mother of Sisera, who's the bad guy in the story, and he's just been killed by Yael. Yeah, yes. And where's Yael? I just saw her here. Yeah. Not you?
the other one.
Oh, the other Yael. Okay, you don't take credit. You don't take credit for that. So she's an Eshet Chaya. So she's a heroine, a wonderful savior of the people, and wonderful story. Very sexy, and there's a lot of sex and death. It would make a wonderful miniseries. So at the end, the wise woman advising Sisera's mother is trying to console her because she says Sisera hasn't come back yet. She says, "Aren't they not finding and dividing the spoil? A young woman, 2 young women for every young man. Spoil of colored cloth for Sisera. Spoil of colored embroidery, 2 colored embroideries for the necks of the despoilers." So she's saying, don't worry, they're just tarrying because they're despoiling the Israelites. In fact, he's dead because Yael killed him, sorry. These things I've underlined are words that are used in the singular, a young woman. The word is racham. And then rachamatayim, which is the dual of racham. And then here you have colored embroidery. The word is rikma. And then here's 2 colored embroideries. That's the dual of rikma, which is rikmatayim. Now the interesting thing is anyone who knows Hebrew knows that the dual is not a productive form in Hebrew. There's certain fossilized forms like yad, hand, yadayim, paired body parts, yadayim, raglayim, givatayim. So there's certain fixed forms that are used. Okay. There's certain fixed forms, things that usually travel in twos like hands and stuff like that. But it's not a productive form. You can't generate a dual of any noun that you want. But here, it looks like they're generating the dual for all sorts of obscure words. Okay, embroidered material, and they use the dual for that. Now, we know that the dual is a productive form in older languages that are related to Hebrew, like Canaanite, the Canaanite language of Ugaritic. I'm giving you some more philology here. In Northwest Semitic languages of the 2nd millennium, the dual is a productive form, and you can use it for anything. So this looks like a really old piece of grammar where the dual is still productive. This either reflects a really early period of Hebrew where the dual was still productive, which is not evidenced anywhere else, or, and this is my suspicion, it's mimicking a Canaanite dialect spoken by Sisera's mother and her court, where the dual was still productive. But this is still really early, because none of the Canaanite dialects of the first millennium have a productive dual. So this is really early stuff. So this is a nice little example, and it's really nice that it's done here in kind of arguably in mimicking a foreigner where the dual is still productive. But this is really early. No one's ever noticed this before. Thank you. I take great pride in that one. This one everyone has noticed. So this is one of the piece from the earliest archaic biblical Hebrew. Here's a little piece from the latest, which is Hellenistic period, the Greek era. And this is in the book of Daniel, which is one of the latest books of the Hebrew Bible. And I just want to show you that this description here, when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, these names are a little obscure, the lyre, the zither, the lute, the flute, and all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the gold statue that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. So the stories of Daniel are set during the period of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar and in the early Persian period, but we can tell from the language and also from some of the other internal references that this was written during the Greek period. This was written in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. And this is a nice example because the words here for well, it's not really a zither. The first word is kithara, Hebrew katros, and kithara is a Greek word for a lyre. The second one, sabcha in Hebrew, is a version of Greek sambuke, which I thought was a kind of liquor, but in fact, it's a small harp. And then the third one, psanterion, is from Greek psalterion, which is a large harp. And then the fourth one that's underlined, symphonia, which sounds like symphony. This is Greek symphonia, which means a bagpipe, which I thought was a Scottish instrument, or a double flute. And this is a Greek double flute. So this fourth word, symphonia, maybe refers to this word, because that's what a double flute is in Greek. So the interesting thing is, and let me say, this part of Daniel is actually written in Aramaic, but it uses these Greek loanwords, these Greek words for instruments, instead of the Aramaic words. Why would they do that? Well, if you're trying to describe a really fine royal orchestra, you use the words that are fancier. And in the Greek era, the Hellenistic era, using Greek was using the kind of superpower language, the language of wealth and culture and things like that, which lend this picture of the orchestra a kind of grandeur and prestige. So there's actually a kind of literary impetus for using Greek words for these instruments, instead of the ordinary Aramaic words, which no one would be impressed by.
It would be like using French in certain
Exactly.
areas of English development.
Mais oui, madame. Mais oui. Yes, exactly. So, if I'm ordering wine and I say, oh, le sommelier, this is fancy. This is pompous. This is grandeur. It's exactly. So French is it has been, I'm not sure it is anymore, the language of high culture, of haute couture. And in the Hellenistic period, Greek was the language of high culture. And so you use this to get that kind of French ambiance to it. So but notice, this gives away when it was written. It was written in a period when Greek was the language of high culture, which means this is the Hellenistic period. So even though it says it's talking about King Nebuchadnezzar, sorry about this, Assyriologists, it wasn't written during the time of the Babylonian Empire. It was written during the Greek period. So these are the kinds of things that give away the age of the different books of the Hebrew Bible. And one of the nice things that I like is that finding these details gets you more deeply into the nuances and the effects of each of these texts, like in the case of the Song of Deborah with the Cicero's mother's speech, and here with the description of this grand orchestra. Question?
Is there any musical notation from this period that you know?
There's no musical note. Well, there might be musical notation, but we don't know how to read it. Actually, in my department in Near Eastern Studies, we used to have an Assyriologist who thought she could read some of these texts that may have been mathematical texts or astronomical texts. You think they were musical texts? Okay. So there were texts that had these weird notation. And so the professor, Ann Kilmer, put out a CD. It's a beautiful. What's that?
LP.
Oh, I'm sorry.
A different millennium.
Okay, this is a good transition to archaeizing, which is my last topic. But she put out an LP with someone who helped her, and it's really beautiful, but we don't really know if that was correct. So there are probably musical notations, but we don't really know how to read them. Good. So the last thing I want to talk about is how late biblical Hebrew, and I think we can already see this from some of these examples, is a classicizing language. And what I mean there is that in late biblical Hebrew, this is to say in post-exilic times, in the Persian and Greek periods, when these books are written in Hebrew, they're trying to write in classical Hebrew. Okay? But they don't consistently understand the syntax, the style, the implicit grammatical rules of classical biblical Hebrew. And so they end up making all these mistakes and reinterpreting things in ways that would have been inconceivable in classical times. And writing sentences that just seem weird to us because they're not imitating classical Hebrew correctly. One of the results here is that each of the books that's written in late biblical Hebrew has a slightly different way of imitating classical Hebrew. So late biblical Hebrew isn't one thing. It seems to be a kind of learned task of these different scribes trying, but failing to a certain degree, to write classical Hebrew. Now this betrays a certain attitude that we have in the Second Temple period towards the classical period. It is a period that one tries to emulate, okay? And another, I think, more important thing that it shows us is that they're reading the classical texts very closely, very intently. And by trying to emulate them, and even doing so to the extent that they're actually reinterpreting, they're misunderstanding and reinterpreting, reanalyzing old forms and structures. This is part of the process, I would say, of what we can call scripturalizing. That is to say, they're studying the book so intently that studying the text itself kind of turns the text, in some respects, into scripture, into that which you study as being authoritative both religiously, linguistically, culturally, and the rest. So I'm not saying that that late biblical Hebrew is the only cause for this, but I think it's evidence for this. It's evidence for the transformation of the classical texts from being texts to being scripture, to being that which you study intently and is so important for you that everything you do is derived from it in one way or another. And here we see that the language itself comes to be derived from it. So this gesture of classicizing and the fact that it's an imperfect classicizing gives us a sense of the intensity with which these Second Temple scribes are reading and studying and trying to enter into and trying to reproduce the classical texts. So this is where I want to end, showing how this linguistic study ends up showing us the development of the Hebrew Bible from being a bunch of texts to being a religious scripture. Thank you. Yes, questions?
So if you go...
How much time?
We have a few minutes.
Okay, a few minutes for
So
questions.
if you start in Israel and you go in any direction except west, You find cultures where they inscribe things in stone and in clay and in papyrus, so we have a lot of their writings. Very little in Israel, but when they came back from Babylonia, so they must have known you could take clay tablets and write stuff that would last. Is there some reason why?
Yeah, well, this is one of the interesting things about what happens, and it's already happening during the Neo-Assyrian period and then the Neo-Babylonian period and into the Persian period. You would think that they would be using clay tablets. But Aramaic becomes the lingua franca already of the Assyrian Empire, and then the Babylonian Empire, and then the Persian Empire. And it's during the Neo-Babylonian and Persian period that the Jews of Israel become Aramaic speakers. So Aramaic, and one of the reasons, tell me if this makes sense, one of the reasons is precisely because Aramaic is, first of all, an alphabetic script, and so it's much easier to learn how to read, and it's written on papyrus, which is much easier, but much cheaper.
Why do we have all these papyruses from Egypt and no papyruses from Israel?
Well, we have the one I showed
Except
you.
for the one you showed me.
It all has to do with the desert. And the same thing with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Those happen to be preserved because they were out in the desert. And some of those are parchment and some of those are papyrus. It all has to do with the weather. If it rains too much, the stuff doesn't last. But it's this Aramaization of the whole Near East that becomes this central thing. And so that's why they're not using clay tablets in the Persian period. Yes?
What about Eo, which has all those strange words, or a secular, almost secular work like Shir Hashirim? What are the dates of those?
Good. So Job is probably one of these transitional books because it has some features of classical Hebrew and a number of features of late biblical Hebrew, and then it also has a lot of very interesting, strange features of its own. And I think the author of Job was, first of all, it's an amazing book, and he has an amazing vocabulary. And I think, I can't prove this, but I think like Shakespeare, I think he made up a lot of words. Some words are only known from Aramaic or from Arabic cognates or from, strange other Semitic languages. I think he, what's that?
He may have been a foreigner.
Yeah, well, he's depicted as being from Edom, the land of Uts. But he's writing in Hebrew, but it's a really weird, it's a very rich Hebrew. And I think this is a brilliant author who's making up new words like Shakespeare did. But it's the only book that we have of that type of. So this is an example where each dialect is a little different once you get into the later period. Song of Songs is quite late. It has a lot of Aramaic influence, has a few Persian words in it, might have one Greek word in it. And it looks like a more vernacular kind of dialect. It's not explicitly trying to be classical, and in part this is because it's voluptuous love poetry, which doesn't really have a classical analog. But it's very late, but it's very, very beautiful. Yes. Oh, I know you.
I wanted to ask you about the book of Daniel
Yeah.
and this the use of Greek words
Mhm.
from musical instruments.
Mm-hmm. This guy knows the expert on this. Yes. Tell me.
Expertise. But your interpretation of this as sort of using Greek words elevates the language.
Yeah.
Suggests that this is coming from the elite because this is the analog you used was French and,
Mhm.
and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But I wonder, since the Book of Daniel was written, or at least the last part of the Book of Daniel, certainly, and maybe some of the earlier parts, were written just at the time of the Maccabean rebellion,
Mm-hmm.
and a period in which there was a reaction against
Right.
Greek hegemony and imperialism and rule over Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a tension here?
Good. Okay, good. So this is a great professor of classics, and I'm so glad I can actually answer this question. The question is, at least the last part of Daniel, and this is my answer, the last part of Daniel seems quite clearly to have been written during the Hasmonean period, when Greek culture was a bad thing. So doesn't that conflict a little bit with the idea that they're using these Greek instrument names to evoke high culture instead of the hated Greek culture? The answer is the first half of Daniel, chapters 1 through 6, were probably written in the 3rd century, 100 years before the Hasmonean period. And so for them, Greek as the language of culture has no problems at all. Did I get you?
I was hoping you would say something like that.
Oh yeah? Okay.
Daniel is, of course, written at different times, at
Yeah.
different parts of Daniel, and including the Aramaic and the Hebrew portions of Daniel.
Yes. Yeah.
Also suggests a development,
Yes.
a response to particular periods of time in which they were composed.
So we actually taught the book of Daniel in a course that we taught a few times, and it was so much fun. This is Eric Gruen, who's a great professor. So we'll do this we'll have a whole class about this. Yes, please.
About the Givatayim,
Mhm.
Shinayim. What
Mhm.
about Yerushalayim?
Oh, okay. Well, we had Yerushalayim. Yeah, the question, this is a little technical, but Jerusalem, in Hebrew, Yerushalayim, that ayim ending looks and smells like the dual ending,
Right.
like rikma, rikmatayim, racham, rachamayim. It's not, though. So we don't know what it is. So people call it the pseudo-dual ending,
And I
which
think-
means we don't know what it is. But there's not two Jerusalems.
Right, and I think in the Hebrew Bible, every time Yerushalayim is mentioned, it's without the Yud, but there is the Chirik under the Lamed,
Yeah,
which means
yeah.
you read it Yerushalayim.
Right. So the medieval punctuators put that ayim in there, even though there's not the right letter for that to be there. There are, I think, 1 or 2 times in the late biblical Hebrew has the Yud, which is nice. Yes, ma'am.
Could you give an example of effort at classicizing?
Yes. I would say, in some respects, that example of Yomam, which is they've kind of forgot the meaning of daily or by day. But so they're using a classical word, but they've sort of forgotten what it means, so they reinterpret it or reanalyze it. That's a kind of a simple example of classicizing. It's as if I'm using, what was it, wherefore. Wherefore, and I used it wrong. So I'm classicizing, but I'm not doing it precisely correctly, and so you can tell that it's not really classic because I'm misusing it. Or at least I'm using it with a later reinterpreted meaning and not with the original classical meaning. So the Yomam is a simple example of that, but there's a lot of other places where they try to emulate verbal forms and syntax. For example, they use, I'm looking at the graduate students here, they'll use the cohortative in a converted form, vayiktala or something like that, which you can't do in classical. See, they know this. You can't do in classical, but they've forgotten the nuances of these grammatical forms, and so they use them, and they think they're right in classical, but they're not getting it right. So that's why it's classicizing. But it shows you their attitude toward the classical language, that they want to write in that, because that's important. It's valuable. Their own language isn't as powerful, or certainly it's not as holy. And so this is the idea of scripturalizing. It betrays an idea that the original classical language is the holy language, the Lashon HaKodesh. And so you see that development there. Yes, question?
What you said is very persuasive.
Thank you.
But
That's because we're right. Okay. That's because we're right and the others are
I
wrong.
also listened to some guy in Paris who has very much adept, somebody who believes in the late writing theory. And he's also very persuasive.
Who's this?
I forget his name, the Collège de France.
Oh, Thomas Romer, good friend of mine.
So he says completely different reasons.
Yeah, yeah.
Very persuasive.
Yeah.
So how did you resolve this?
I resolved this because I love Thomas Romer, and he was here last month. And on this issue, I'm right and he's wrong. But over enough red wine, we might be able to reach.
But you don't establish the truth of what you say. You should actually, in some way, be able to say what the other guy is saying is not right for the following reason.
Yeah, so this is a problem in my field. Because he's a very intelligent, I mean, he's at the Collège de France. He's a brilliant guy, and he's got excellent taste in wine. This whole thing about linguistic history, historical linguistics, they barely do that in the linguistics department here at Berkeley. It's regarded as a very 19th century thing to do. And similarly, in the field of biblical studies, it's not taught very many places. It's not taught anywhere in Europe. It's only taught at a couple places in the States and a couple places in Israel.
Yes, but how did it what he said was very persuasive, but completely different.
Yeah.
So how do you contradict him?
I say if you look at the language, if you agree that we have linguistic texts and that linguistic criteria have a certain weight, because that's all we have is texts, or mostly what we have is text. So if you grant that language has a history, then it's incumbent upon you to try to ascertain that history and use that as your very first criterion.
So how would he contradict you?
He would say, we don't really know the history of Hebrew that well. And I would say, read our book. And then tell me that. And then we'll have a big jug of red wine and talk about it some more.
So is he not using language that much? He uses other kind of arguments? Is it like
Yes, he's using other kinds of arguments. And so my argument is that those other kinds of arguments should come second or third. They should be secondary or tertiary arguments, and the argument from language should come first. And I don't think he would disagree with that. I mean, after the second bottle of wine, I think I could get him.
So you haven't told him about this yet?
I gave him a copy of the book. I hope he read it on the plane ride home. But we're going to work on this. And this is what scholarly conversation is about. And he's one of the people that I can talk to and have a conversation without it becoming a kind of sectarian battle.
He's very good lectures.
He's a brilliant guy.
What is his name, please?
Thomas Romer.
Romer?
Yeah. Collège de France. Yes, Anne.
Yeah, so I want to know the answer to your question, which is how old is the Bible? Meaning, how old are the oldest parts, the Song of the Sea,
So
the Song of Deborah?
so
And I want to ask if you think those poetic chunks that are the most ancient were incorporated into the later texts from directly from an oral tradition, or were they part of books of some sort, the rest of which has been lost?
Good.
Do you have answered?
Yeah, you're asking exactly the right questions. I would say on the basis just of language that this is, old, pretty old, pretty darn old, and then I would say, it's before the Floruit of classical Hebrew, so we're talking about early 9th, 10th, 11th century BC. And then I would say, within the content of the poem, they're talking about a battle between these tribal elements of Israel, and not all of the tribes show up, and so that some of them get cursed because they didn't have a mechanism to make people come, which means there's not a central government yet. So this is a tribal kind of acephalous society. It's a tribal society. There's no king. There's no central standing army. There's no central institutions. So this looks like a poem that originated before the rise of kingship, before David and Saul and Solomon and those people. So that also makes it look 10th, 11th century BC. That's pretty darn early.
Which one is she referring to?
The Song of Deborah in Judges 5. But I would say the other poems that have those markers of archaic biblical Hebrew are from roughly the same period. So that's how old. So that's a good. And the second part of your question, these old poems are short enough so that they could have been transmitted orally for a certain amount of time, and then obviously at some point they're written down, and then they're combined in these classical texts. They're inserted into these classical texts, perhaps by the people that wrote the classical texts, who inserted them in at these key moments where praise and victory and stuff, or someone dying, Moses or Jacob dying. So I think there probably is, but we can't really tell, but a certain period of oral transmission makes sense, because they're short enough to be able to do that. Okay,
So
we're
Ron's
done.
unique lecturing style is able to evoke something or generate something rarely seen. That's the academic lecture with call and response in the middle of the lecture. So
Thank you.
thank Ron for